arrests in just a moment. A Florida man who escaped murder charges by testifying that his father died naturally and that he merely chopped up the body and buried part of it to hide an illicit drug trade received the maximum sentence, 15 years behind bars. Before we get to the emotional statements of family and friends, let's take a look back at the key and at times gruesome moments during the trial with Law&Crime's Jesse Weber.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
James Scandirito Jr. was charged with murder but did not face the death penalty over the death of his father, James Sr. Prosecutors say a police dog found some of the father's remains buried at a golf course.
It is gruesome. It is despicable. In one of the garbage bags is the upper torso of a human being with the head cut off, decapitated.
The state argued that James killed his father after taking his money and using his debit card. Plus, the state had evidence of premeditation.
The defendant is eventually arrested in Alachua County on April 9th. And when he is, you'll hear that there are 2 different passports found with him. He has flight time itineraries. He has a contact number for a private jet company. The defendant is an individual who did everything he possibly could to get away with murder.
The defense said the victim introduced his son to drugs and that the two were dealing drugs together.
Most of his business was in cash. The elder Scandirito was aware of this and sometimes would actually make trips to states like Washington and Colorado to assist with acquiring supply.
The defense argued that James Jr. chopped up his father's body after believing James Sr. died of an overdose. James Jr. feared that simply calling in the death would lead police to his stash of drugs.
Jimmy did something that he deeply regrets, and that is unfathomable to most individuals.
For the Law&Crime Network, I'm Jesse Weber.
The state's arguments were not enough in this case. The jury acquitted James Jr. of first-degree murder, but convicted him of abusing his father's dead human body. When police initially questioned the defendant about his father's disappearance, he claimed his father was probably just out having sex, and that's why his father wasn't around. On the witness stand, the defendant backtracked. He admits to carving up his father's body using duct tape and trash bags this surveillance video shows him purchasing in order to dispose of his father's remains. Here now, let's listen to the defendant's shocking testimony.
Have you decided in your mind what you're going to have to do?
I have.
And what was that?
That I'm going to have to dismember my dad to be able to move him out of the house. I rolled the dolly over when I am doing the dismembering of the extremities. There's a space in front of the, of course you've seen it all many times, in front of the refrigerator when you come out of the garage on the left side, and if you're looking on the left side of the garage, there's a space there. So I had laid a clear tarp down. The dolly was on top of the cart, on top of the tarp. And then I had another tarp that went over over the top of the dolly and the plastic tarp that was underneath the dolly.
Okay. And so when you are actually cutting him, you're using what?
A saw.
Okay. An electric saw or a hand saw?
No, it's a handsaw.
And when you are actually cutting him, are you doing that underneath the top part?
Yes.
And why is that?
Because I can't look at what I'm doing. I just can't.
Okay, he couldn't look at what he was doing, carving up his father's body, but he could describe how he collected and disposed of the remains.
I take a garbage bag and I kind of cover the part that is being dismembered. So when the arm, let's say, is finally dismembered, it's kind of falls into the garbage bag.
And with those garbage bags individually, what did you do with them?
When I eventually ended up putting them all into 3 suitcases. Maybe it's not, physically strenuous, but, it wasn't, it was not something that it was a quick, it was a long time. I would take frequent breaks, go out through the garage door, into the outside of the house, the side of the house, smoke cigarettes, and just, wish that this nightmare wasn't happening.
Okay, but he did let it happen, he said, to hide his illicit drug trade. What should the punishment be for this conviction for carving up his father's corpse? The victim's niece has been vocal about the family's disgust for the defendant.
He's been rewarded for destroying and hiding evidence in the form of a human body, the body of the man who gave him life, for dealing with someone who has no regard for human life. He had no respect for his father nor anyone else. He doesn't feel. He doesn't respect us, the remaining members of his family, who are the very people who have been here since the beginning to clean up the mess that he made. And I should add, Your Honor, that Jimmy Scandirito hasn't made any attempts to reach out to any of us to apologize for everything he's put us through, all the lies he's told, and most importantly, the horrific act of what he unapologetically did to his father. They finally released Scandirito's torso, severed torso, and the rest of his body could not be laid to rest. This whole process, yet again, was completely traumatizing. It was the Scandirito family who had a beautiful memorial for his father. Over 200 people attended to celebrate and to honor him, since the person who was supposed to honor him did everything but that.
The victim's cousin also spoke to the court today and said it was pathetic that the defendant threw out his own father's body parts like common household trash.
Jimmy's request that the court sentence him to 24 months of drug offender probation or inpatient treatment is beyond despicable. He was not convicted of a drug offense or many of the other crimes he may have committed. Jimmy cannot blame his chronic substance abuse problem or bogus claim he was protecting his father, but a much deeper sickness that should not be rewarded by spending a few years in a substance abuse treatment facility. His actions have personally destroyed me the past 14 months. From this laborious legal process, going to the funeral home to pick up what was left of his father's ashes, making sure his father and mother's ashes were together in Michigan for a proper burial, organizing a respectful funeral service in Florida for his friends, and the countless trips to the house, and the true pain of seeing all the personal belongings of a lifetime and so many memories of someone I loved and who loved me unconditionally. Please, Your Honor, do not slap him on the wrist for the most reprehensible crime. He needs to go to prison to serve the maximum sentence permitted by law.
Here tonight on The Debrief are judges Ashley Wilcott from Georgia, Brandon Birmingham from Texas, and criminal defense attorney Linda Candy-Bodden from New York. So Linda, I'll start with you. You practice criminal defense law. Are you impressed by this defense team's ability to beat the murder charge by admitting to the dismemberment?
I love your question about beating the murder charge. I think that once this defense team heard him, as many of us did here in Law and Crime, we believed him because he was so odd. He was so bizarre. He had every little detail. I'm going to take the dolly and go around here, the hors d'oeuvre server full of cocaine, that they decided that a jury had to hear him. And boy, they heard him, and I think if he didn't testify, he would have been convicted of the murder.
Okay, I agree with that as well. But, look, I think that this was the kind of verdict, Linda, that the jury turned around and said, I'm not sure I necessarily believe this guy, that he didn't kill, but maybe the state didn't have enough evidence to prove that he did, because where's most of the body? That's my take on it. Judge Birmingham, was it too much in this case for the state to ask for the maximum here to basically spite the defendant for beating the murder charge and getting convicted on the dismemberment charge?
Well, I mean, I would suggest to you that in the range of charges, the ways that certain crimes can be accomplished, the abuse of a human corpse, there's ranges that crime can be accomplished. This one, the way that this was accomplished was well thought out. It was sophisticated, as the judge said. There was an element of planning, of covering up, of premeditation, of premeditation and covering up that lasted even though his family members were asking where is his father, and he still covered up. And so there was that element of covering up that ran all the way through up until, I guess, he testified.
Exactly. Okay, so an independent grounds for the maximum sentence on the charge where there was a conviction here. Judge Wilcott, the state also asked for $87,000 in restitution for police overtime. Officers were running around looking for the father, and the defendant was lying to them about where the father was. The judge scheduled another hearing for that request. If you were on the bench in this case, how would you rule?
I think that it would depend on how the police testified. If police testified that they continued to ask for information and he continued to cover it up, then I would consider ordering the restitution, because it's taxpayers' money that's spent covering up a crime he now admits to.
You know, good points from our judges here. This is why you're both on the bench, and I don't have that experience because.
What about me, Aaron?
Okay, go ahead, Linda. What do you have to say about this?
That's okay. I don't want to be on the bench. It's all right. I'll just answer your hard questions.
So you don't have an opinion on the restitution. That shocks me.
Yeah, actually, I do have an opinion on the restitution. If the law says there has to be restitution, it's going to happen. That's it. I mean, that's the way it is. I'd be very happy that I'm not in jail for murder.
Okay, so, Judge Wilcott, I think you had the right idea. Look, have a hearing on it, put some things on the record, then make the decision. I'll go with that, and we'll wait for that hearing. Moving on now to two national cases we have to discuss tonight. First, the judge will allow a special prosecutor to look into the case of actor Jussie Smollett. The special prosecutor will examine the motives of State Attorney Kim Foxx, who publicly recused herself from the case, then continued to communicate with her staff about the case. The special prosecutor could even reopen the case against Smollett himself. Smollett was accused of faking a racist and homophobic attack on himself through the help of two other actors with whom he had worked. A guilty plea from a California man in a nationwide college admissions scandal. 56-year-old Toby McFarland admitted to mail fraud charges for paying bribes to ensure his children would be admitted to the University of Southern California. He could have faced 20 years, but the plea deal will keep him behind bars for 15 months. The deal may have been similar to the one offered to actress Lori Loughlin. Still ahead tonight here on the Debrief, a look forward to two trials which begin next week, plus deliberations push into another week in the McStay family murder case. Will it be death or life in prison for defendant Chase Merritt? That is after the break. Preparing to bring you two death penalty trials starting with the new week. The first in Texas, where defendant Wesley Matthews faces trial on charges he killed his special needs daughter and dumped her body in a culvert. 3-year-old Sharon Matthews is the victim. The defendant claimed that the daughter disappeared in October 2017 after he left her outside their home to punish her. The second case is in Florida. Defendant Scott Nelson will be tried on charges he kidnapped and killed 56-year-old Jennifer Fulford. The victim was an in-home personal care assistant, and the defendant is accused of taking her from the house where she worked and then dumping her body in a wooded area. The defense has argued that Nelson's mental health status will make it hard for him to testify at trial. At least 9 American tourists have died recently in the Dominican Republic, raising questions about what's occurring in a number of resorts. Today on the Law and Crime Network, forensic death examiner Joseph Scott Morgan raised questions about why official causes of death are difficult to pinpoint many times in some foreign countries.
The way it works is when an autopsy takes place, you draw blood, urine, vitreous, bile, all these other fluids. You send it to the lab. And in a common screening, all these cases that we talk about on Law and Crime, all of these cases, you get a standard panel done, okay, which is looking for illicit drugs of abuse. You also look for some common medications and that sort of thing that people take. But what they don't take into account are what are referred to as exotics or poisons. Things like organophosphates that are used in certain insecticides, which are now banned in the U.S. You don't look for those. They're exotic things that you don't look for. They might not have the sophistication to look that deep into it. There's several of these cases, Jesse. I know of one right off the top of my head where toxicology is still pending from 2018, and they said that the person died of a heart attack without making some kind of appropriate chemical diagnosis on the individual. And that's unheard of here in the U.S.
Dominican Republic officials say the number of tourist deaths this year is not out of the ordinary. A jury has called it quits for the weekend without reaching a verdict in the penalty phase of a California trial involving the murders of a family of 4. A jury convicted Chase Merritt of killing business associate Joseph McStay and McStay's family. The trial started in January and has dragged on for more than 5 months. The state's closing argument focused on the brutality of the killings. Remember, the victims were beaten to death, presumably with a hammer found in their graves.
The defendant kept taking advantage of Joseph, forging checks, relying on him for emergency funds, for rent and other purposes, all to be found buried in a grave 3 years, 9 months, 7 days later. But look at the injuries. You can even see one in that initial photograph, which is the gaping hole in the back of his skull as he lays in that grave. The massive force of impact that must have occurred to shatter a human skull that severely.
The defense presented no mitigation case to try to save Charles Merritt's life. Instead, the defense fired back at gaps in the state's case, even though this same jury agreed the evidence was strong enough for a conviction. The defense strategy is to use any remaining doubt in the mind of perhaps even one juror as leverage away from a death sentence.
In retrospect, the prosecution's case is nothing. It's barking and screaming. And there's no substance to it. You got character assassination. You got gambling, greed, checks, backdate, QuickBooks, blah, blah, blah. And whatever they said to you, with no exaggeration, whatever they said to you about QuickBooks was either taken out of context or unimportant and irrelevant. Why? Because there was never a theft, ever. So, being the realist that I am, I understand that many of you have tuned me out and will continue to tune me out, and that's okay. Because I know there's a few of you who understand what I'm saying and agree with at least the premise that you may have been sold a bill of goods. Because you have. And you don't know it now because you can't have access to anything. You will know it soon. You're not only going to be able to see the trial, but you're going to see the motions, everything that you guys had to wait outside for, you're going to see it all. It's all on the internet, every day. And you're going to see what I'm telling you is true. You're going to see that these prosecutors sold you a bill of goods. You're going to see that this family is not getting justice. At some point you will reflect on this. And maybe you will watch that gavel-to-gavel coverage, and you'll say, there was no evidence. There was a lot of barking and a lot of screaming and a lot of shouting, but there was no evidence.
Returning tonight on the debrief are Judges Brandon Birmingham and Ashley Wilcott, along with criminal defense attorney Linda Kenny Bodden. So, Judge Wilcott, let me start with you here. This sounds like a great closing from the perspective of watching the case here in a broadcast. Is it something that's going to resonate with a jury, though? Because basically the defense is turning around and saying, jurors, you got it wrong the first time, and you need to now reconcile the fact that you got it wrong.
That's what I'm afraid of for the defense. Because listen, juries are sophisticated in my experience, and from the judicial perspective, you don't want to accidentally do or say anything that might be offensive to the jury. And that's basically what they are saying. I agree with you, Aaron. Hey, there was some reasonable doubt that you all missed, but it might resonate enough to say, hey, just in case he didn't do it, let's go ahead and not give him the death penalty. But I don't think it's the best defense argument to be made.
Judge Birmingham, I've been looking at this case as fair as I can. I don't think the state proved its burden personally. But look, I do have some ethical issues with the defense saying, you know, members of the jury, just fast forward and pretend you could hear everything that you didn't get to hear, and you should consider, in other words, evidence that didn't make it into evidence, and arriving at some kind of a conclusion here for this penalty phase. Does that strike you does that make you uneasy as well?
Well, you know, Mr. Keller, you were right in my judicial head as I was listening to the argument, because he's inviting them to consider things that are not part of the record. He's implying that things have gone on that the jurors should know about, and that he is also inviting them to make a decision based on that. In other words, he's asking them to make a decision based on something they haven't heard in court, and that is a quintessential no-no when you're making an argument. And so you and I are probably in agreement on that.
Okay, we're in agreement on it. I also think some of the calls in this are not necessarily the calls that I hope that both of your honors would be making. Linda Kenny Bodden, we've been back and forth on this case. The jury deliberated yesterday. They deliberated today. They're pushing it into another week. What's going on?
Well, either they're going to think it over overnight, or over the weekend, and come back with a guilty verdict or whatever they're going to do, or there's some jurors who are going to say, hey, look, we made a deal, you know, in our heads that I would vote guilty, but I'm not going to vote guilty for the death penalty. And I'd just like to address quickly what you just said before. You know, here the defense did play by the rules. We had a segment earlier here on Law and Crime with Jeffrey Descovich on, who was convicted even though DNA did not match him in a crime. Spent 16 years wrongfully convicted in jail. There is DNA that was never put into the code of status space. I'm convinced that the defense needs to do what they need to do to save this man, because that was so improper to begin with.
Yeah, judges, I have to ask, you know, what happens if the prosecution refuses to test DNA in your courtroom, Judge Wilcott?
If there was a defense motion asking for the state to pay for it, then I would grant that, because I would not want that evidence not to be considered.
You know, can you force a prosecutor to actually run it through CODIS? That's a big question. We're going to have to tackle it another day, though. Judges, Attorney Bodden, we have to wrap up for the debrief. We will be back on Monday with our usual recap at this hour of cases nationwide. Have a good weekend, everybody. Our live trial coverage begins at 9 a.m. Monday.